So I have one more question for you, and then we'll see how we are on time. Maybe we could take one or two from the audience. But um, obviously, we're in the middle of a U.S. imperialist war against Iran. I mean, I haven't been following everything because we've been live, but the latest thing I looked at was that it seems like this, brief respite is coming to an end, and it's very likely that we return to full-on, war within, maybe even the next 24 hours, right? And so I think there's a couple of things that are important to say about this. One is, of course, as we know, the U.S. left, whatever that means, is not doing a good job, right, of showing solidarity with the Iranian people and the state that defends them from the U.S. military and U.S. imperialism. And I think that, two, that there has to be some acknowledgement, given that the last couple of years, that perhaps the most powerful offensive struggle against imperialism right now in this moment, um, whether you or I like it or not, right, is not necessarily communist or Marxist, right, but that a lot of these forces are Islamic forces, with a few exceptions, like the PFLP, right, and but like with communism, there has also been a very extensive state foundation, national security nexus project to demonize Islam for decades. Um, and so all of those are just facts, right? How do we account for the US left's failures here, and how might we try to correct them in your view?
I think Ali Kadri's work is excellent on this. Max Isle as well has done really important work. There are a number of others kind of working in this vein. I do think that you have to situate contemporary Asia within its deeper history, and there's been an imperialist war on pan-Arab socialism for decades and decades, and an effort to balkanize the entire region and to destroy the communist movement. So much so that any of the resistance movements that have been successful at certain levels, there's also a way in which you see this in the case of Iran. If the imperial forces lose their grip, the very last thing they want to have happen is to have the progressive forces come to power. And so when they see that happening, they actually find ways of supporting more conservative forces. It is important to recognize, of course, as well, that there are many. Religion is a very interesting phenomenon because it can be pushed and pulled, and has been historically, in many, many different directions. And there are versions of Islam that, of course, are part of a broader liberation struggle and a fight for national development. And you have many manifestations of that in West Asia. You also have reactionary versions of Islam, like you have reactionary versions of Judaism, Christianity, and other religions. And we have to be able to identify those as such. One of the things that I think Ali Kadri has pointed out importantly is that it's also due to the kind of balkanization of West Asia and the decimation also of systems of knowledge production. Look at what they're doing in Iran, right? They're just bombing schools, bombing universities. They are literally trying to bomb them back into the Stone Age, as they say, to destroy the fabric of knowledge production. And given what has happened historically in West Asia, when you don't have the stronger kind of Marxist elements within the intelligentsia and within organized politics, what are the forces that are going to allow people to organize themselves in such a way that they can galvanize against imperialism? Well, in many instances, it is religious. The way I think it's most coherent to frame some of what's going on is, I'm sure that you've seen that many in the Western left are critical of what they call campism. And they suggest that if you defend the right to armed self-defense on the part of those who are the victims of imperialism, or the right to state power, other things like this, that somehow you're getting in bed with the worst of the worst. You're involved in being in a camp with the, fundamentalists and all of this. These arguments. What's interesting and I think very important, and something that I'm considering writing an article on, is the way in which this critique of so-called campism doesn't engage in a dialectical materialist analysis of contradictions. And this is manifest in one of the regular phrases that's used to denigrate so-called campists. They say that, well, campists think that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But that's not the position that anti-imperialists take, because it's not a moral issue and it's not a subjective question. And what they're trying to do is reduce geopolitics to something like a question of interpersonal relationships of friendship. I mean, the metaphor itself is highly revealing. From a dialectical and historical materialist point of view, what's important is to analyze different levels of conflict and struggle and identify the primary ones. The primary contradiction is between the imperialist and anti-imperialist forces in this world. Therefore, what Iran or other forces in West Asia are doing is they are pushing back against the expanse of Western and in particular US Israeli imperialism. Therefore, it makes absolute sense to support the struggle for the liberation from imperialism, instead of attempting to make secondary contradictions, because of course there are struggles within Iran, there are struggles within the liberation struggle in Palestine, or other examples that one could point to. But if you try to make those secondary contradictions into the primary contradiction, and you say, well, what we need to do is support the people of Iran in a way that they would struggle against their state, in this particular moment, making that secondary contradiction into the primary contradiction can very easily, and often does, play into the hands of the imperialists, because what they want is a weakened state or oppositional force that would be much easier to divide and conquer. It's also important from a materialist vantage point to distinguish between antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions. The contradiction between imperialism and anti-imperialism is antagonistic. There's no way, unfortunately, of democratically resolving this. Those who are the victims of empire are constantly trying to do this, extending olive branch after olive branch, being extremely restrained in the response, begging for some type of democratic resolution. But the imperialists will not have it. Therefore, they're forced. They don't fetishize armed struggle. They don't love being bombed and responding in turn. They would much rather take a different path, but they have no choice. Within that condition, the secondary contradictions, meaning the struggles within a country like Iran, often become much less, if not entirely, antagonistic, meaning the forces become galvanized against the primary enemy. What this means is that what these critiques of the campist so-called position end up doing is they often try to make the secondary contradictions into primary contradictions and make them antagonistic contradictions. If you actually succeed in doing that, what you're doing is fostering dissension within the anti-imperialist camp and confusion that aids and abets, to varying degrees depending on the positions that we're taking, the struggle to try to destroy them. We have to, I think, be very clear-eyed about what this is then. And so for those who would say that, well, Iran has the right to self-defense, it shouldn't be bombed into the Stone Ages, or its civilization should not be eliminated, these genocidal forces should be held at bay. This does not mean that the person who proffers this position is saying, I support absolutely everything that Iran has or will ever do. I'm getting in bed with these people, I'm friends with these people, or anything along those lines. This is the reduction of a complex set of contradictions that need to be understood at a materialist and dialectical level to a moralizing subjectivism that is rooted in the idea that, well, what I support is the same thing as what I am. This kind of consumerist relationship to politics. I say Iran has a right to self-defense, therefore I am a supporter of everything Iranian, or everything that the Iranian state represents. No, what I'm doing is I'm engaging in a materialist analysis, recognizing that we have to privilege the primary contradiction, recognize secondary and tertiary contradictions, also support struggles within various countries or movements to move things in a more progressive direction, but also be very clear-eyed about what it means at one point in time to support and make primary the principal contradiction, and how we need to shelve the kind of moralist subjectivism of those ultimately, whether they know they're doing it or not, they're serving at an intellectual level, at a minimum, the interests of empire by trying to divide and confuse those who are opposed to imperialism.